We're recording. All right. And let me go ahead and start my YouTube recording. Okay. So back to cultural anthropology. We're at chapter 2 in the book Humanity by Peoples. And like I said, you can use any version, the older, the cheaper. And make sure you look at those key terms when they first appear in the text. They should be in bold, and you should find them at the end of each chapter, and the definitions will be in the glossary. But I'm going to be working my way through chapter 2 today. And chapter 2 is about cultural knowledge. And if you remember how we define culture as opposed to race, race is biological, it's genetically inherited. Culture is learned behavior. So you could be from any, what we talked about, there is only one biological race of humans. So that means any human, biological human, could learn theoretically any culture because it is a taught behavior. It's not something you're born with. All right. There's a couple major ideas we're going to deal with, and these are like norms, values, and laws. And so norms is just like what it sounds. It's what is normal in your society, in your culture. That's what a norm is. Now, being the sophisticated postmoderns that most of you probably are, you're saying, oh, Blackburn, but what's normal? Well, normal, at least according to ethical relativism, is what your society, what your culture says is normal. And we have all been taught or enculturated from a very young age what is normal behavior and what is abnormal behavior. And that's why we can immediately identify if someone is acting abnormally in our culture. Now, normal behavior in our culture may be quite abnormal in another culture and vice versa. And so that's something you need to be aware of, especially if you're traveling or interacting with people from different places. I would like to say with different times too, but we don't have much time travel going on at the moment that I'm aware of. But especially if you're in business or missions, evangelism, even just traveling, it would behoove you to do an overview of the country you're visiting and see what some of their basic norms are. For example, modesty. If you're coming from Southern California, even traveling in different parts of the country, you could really shock some people if you dress the way you normally dress here in Southern California. My recommendation is always dress more conservative, because usually people aren't offended or put off by people dressed more modestly or conservatively than them. It's usually if you're coming in under the bar. And then once you get to learn a place, its customs, you can adjust appropriately. Even things like eye contact. In our culture, we are taught from a very young age not to stare, right? How many times did your mom or dad tell you, don't stare, don't point? And we're taught to ignore unusual or abnormal behavior. And we're just supposed to act like, I don't see you walking around in a loincloth in Parkway Plaza. We just ignore it and hope it goes away. But in other cultures, they are taught to point out abnormal behavior. One of my former students, she was pretty edgy, kind of had a fashion punk thing going. She had like a mohawk with spiked hair and all kinds of piercings and tattoos. And she went to Taiwan on vacation. And she went and visited some of the rural villages. And in some of the villages she went to, literally everyone in the village would be staring at her and pointing at her and saying in Chinese, I'm assuming, would you look at that person? And she was so offended. And when she got back, she was telling to me of her bad experience. And I was like, I mean, what do you expect? I mean, you're presenting yourself in a very edgy way. And in Southern California, it's not going to be that big a deal, right? But if you go someplace like Taiwan, especially into the countryside, you are going to stand out. And so you shouldn't be so shocked when in that culture, they're going to point you out for your unusual looking appearance. So norms are what is normal. And there's three criteria for them. There's widespread agreement on what is normal in your culture. You are judged based on how well you adhere to the norms. In other words, if you're behaving normally, you're going to be left alone. If you behave abnormally, you're going to get some pushback, or people are going to point you out or call you on it. And then thirdly, violators will be persecuted. And this could be legally, or it could simply be socially. People might be shunned. That is a major way that people are brought into conformity. When you're not acting normal, people may not want to sit with you in the cafeteria. They may not want to go on outings or dates with you. And so we use that sort of social distancing or exclusion to try to bring people into conformity. And I guess my next question would be, do you know your cultural norms? So let's start with like a broad view of America. What would be some American norms? And I'd like 3 examples, things that are normal in American society.
What's it called? Vloggers? That'd be like a subculture, right? Oh, wait, I'm tripping. I'm so tripping. My fault. I misunderstood the question.
What would be an example of normal behavior in our society? Like, see, right now you just raised your hand before you spoke. That is like a normal conditioning in our culture, where we have been taught from a young age, from like preschool or kindergarten, to behave a certain way in class, right? If you're not the one teaching, you're supposed to sit there quietly, pay attention, not distract the teacher or your classmates. That would be normal behavior in an American classroom. But also in America, we have been taught to have like a rapport with our teachers, where you can ask your teacher's question, you can ask for clarification. In Eastern education models, it would be seen as incredibly disrespectful to ask your teacher a question, because it would imply the teacher wasn't doing their job and they weren't being clear. Isn't that fascinating? And so I did not know that when I taught my first ESL classes. I had a class of 20 students. They were all Koreans from South Korea. They spoke English as a second language, but I could not get them to interact or dialogue with me, because they were brought up that that was incredibly disrespectful to even ask for clarification of your teacher. You were just supposed to treat your teacher with reverence and deference and just nod and act like you understood what was going on. And you can imagine, for my teaching style, that did not work. And so I had to learn how to teach Koreans, and they had to learn how to learn from a California professor who had a very different teaching style than what they grew up with. And in the end, we both learned a lot from each other, but that's one of the norms I'm talking about. Also, how they studied, they were also very collective in their thinking. They loved group work. They loved doing assignments. One day I was giving a test, and I had to go to a quick meeting or something. And when I came back, they were all huddled around taking the test together. And I was like, what the heck is going on in here? And they looked at me and they were like, what? This is how we always do tests where we come from. Well, I checked with some other Koreans later, and they said, no, Blackburn, that is not how we do tests. But they were trying to use that collective thing on me to act like their cheating or fudging on the test was a part of their normal behavior. But just so interesting, even things like education, teaching, learning. Let me give you another example. Besides staring, what's our norms about, and I'm talking pre-COVID, it's changing, but what were our norms about body space or personal space in our culture?
I feel like when it comes to body space, it's pretty normal to be near people, but there's still like at least a foot difference between people.
A
So like,
foot?
right now I'm sitting next to Autumn and Joe, and there's like a foot between me and
I
them.
want full
But
arm
that's how it would
length.
be normally. And then with other people that I don't know, I'd stand a little further away. But if with other people that I know even better, like I would be like right next to them, like touching them. And so it kind of like for
Are
our
you
culture, it
from
depends
an
on
American
how well we know
culture,
them. But like
Liz?
it, you know what I mean?
No, I don't. Liz, are you from an American culture? You are? Liz? Liz, can you hear me?
That's how it is, kind of like how I've grown up. I mean, I've grown up in America, but I've also like learned Hispanic culture.
Right,
So it's
because
kind of like a combination for me.
okay, right, because at least the way I was brought up, and this goes all the way back to um, kindergarten, is we were taught to give each other dimes, like a full arm's length away from each other. You're not to be in other people's faces. You want to give them a lot of distance. And at least for me personally, I don't care if it's a student or a colleague or a stranger, if they're right up in my business, it makes me really uncomfortable. But in other cultures, it's more like Liz was saying, especially people you're close to, friends or family, you may be physically touching each other, that kind of closeness. But that is one of those things we learn culturally. Um, how about eye contact? What what are the American norms or California norms about eye contact?
You can have
Well,
some, but not too much.
Okay, like a glancing contact, right?
Yeah.
But what
That's right,
are you
Kendall.
saying, Kendall, if you have prolonged eye contact with someone?
Oh shoot, I don't know. I don't know what it's portraying. I'd have to think about that. But I just
How
know when
would you
people are like,
interpret it if someone, and would it matter if it was male or female? Would you feel differently if
oh
a
yeah,
female had long engaged eye contact or another male had long engaged contact? Would you interpret those two things differently?
I would. I would assume that the female eye contact would be taken more as like flirting, because that's kind of what our culture has made it. And then for a guy eye contact, I don't even know. I don't experience that often. A guy staring into my soul for minutes on end doesn't really happen that often.
Normally, you are correct about the female or the different genders. It's usually seen as a come hither or a come on or showing an interest, right? But usually if it's of the same gender, I don't know, you females can educate me on this one, but when a guy makes prolonged eye contact with another guy, it's usually seen as a challenge.
Yeah.
I
Like,
mean, usually
I dare you to.
but with my group of friends, when the guys are looking at each other in the eyes, it's because they're acting super gay with each other.
Hey, Mr.
Well,
Black
that's
Pearl,
interesting.
Mr. Black
And so
Pearl.
maybe things are changing from when I grew up, but when I grew up, there was very little same gender, at least public flirting. But certainly today that could be it. But if you want to do a social experiment, I'm not recommending this, but if you got on the trolley in Santee and rode to downtown San Diego, you could try to have prolonged eye contact with different people on the trolley, and you could record their different reactions to you. But you may come back with a black eye or someone that wants to date you. So you have to be careful with these kind of social experiments. But that is another one of those things that in our culture, you're not supposed to look at people in the eyes, at least for a prolonged period of time. That's seen as it goes against our social norms. So everything from modesty to a gaze to social distancing, we are taught these things from an early age on. Okay, next is values. And these are like the ideals that your culture is striving for. These are beliefs regarding a way of life or goals like the good life. So, for example, we would call our values like the American dream. What what would that be? What are these high values that Americans are taught from a young age to hold to? Anyone want to give a shot at either what is the American dream, or give me an American value, something that virtually all Americans would adhere to?
Looking a certain way.
Okay, physical appearance, how we present ourselves.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Give me a value.
Maybe like money.
Yes, wealth. That's a huge American value. Wealth, security, prosperity, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, right? Freedom, democracy, freedom of speech. These are all American values that we're taught from a very early age. And if we feel those threatened, I mean, most Americans will react very strongly against that. When we talk about evaluating America and how we're doing, we're probably going to look at things like gross national product, amount of income people are making, our health care, but that's not how all cultures evaluate well-being. Some cultures, like I think Bhutan, they measure how well they're doing by how happy the people are. That's not, happiness isn't necessarily an American value, right? We certainly want to be happy, but we're probably much more concerned in like the wealth, the health, the security. And if we have those things, then maybe we'll be happy. But for other cultures, happiness might come in the midst of poverty, sickness, lack of opportunity, but they generally have a joyful outlook on life. And maybe it's because of their relationships, their families, where they live. They don't have a lot of stress necessarily on their lives. And so values are those overarching high ideals that a culture has. And then nextly, we have laws. And so norms, this is what's normal. Values, these are the ideals we're shooting for. And laws are norms that have the weight of civil authority behind them. And so, for example, a norm in our culture would be a certain level of hygiene where people can't smell your body odor. But as far as I know, we don't have laws that you could get ticketed or arrested because you smelled funny, okay? So that's the difference between the norm is to have a certain level of hygiene, but we haven't enforced that with a civil law. Now people may ostracize you. They may not want to sit near you. Maybe your professor may ask you to leave class if you're meeting in person. I guess that's another Zoom advantage, right? If you're smelly, I can't tell. It's more benefits of virtual learning. But that would be an example. Other norms, we have put the weight of the law behind. So for example, let's take modesty. There are certain limits, even in our very lenient California culture, where you can't just go around butt naked, right, in a lot of venues. And you actually could have to deal with the civil authorities if that's how you chose to roll. And so we do enforce some norms with laws, and other norms are enforced through social behavior modification techniques. And I'll get into that in a minute. Okay. Now, with this cultural knowledge, it's a collective understanding, and most of it, it's not like you were formally taught. It's just something you get almost like by osmosis from growing up around a certain people group. Let me give you a micro example. If you were raised Roman Catholic, and then you went, like say from the time you were born, you're christened in the Roman Catholic Church, you're brought up, you go through catechism, you go through mass, and then you come to us and now you're seeing like this evangelical chapel service or one of your friends invites you to like evangelical community church or Bible believing church, it could be quite culturally shocking. Even though you grew up in the church your whole life, the norms of what a Catholic service is like are going to be quite different from like a Baptist or Pentecostal church service. Same thing. If you grew up Baptist Pentecostal and then went to like a Catholic or Episcopalian church, it could be quite shocking how formal it is and how ritualized compared to maybe your more loosey-goosey environment in a lower type church. And I mean lower in, it's not this high ritual routine that is being gone through around the world with all the people in that denomination or sect. Another part of culture is cultures teach us symbols. And remember, symbols are to try to represent a concept, idea, object, or thing with an item. And one of the greatest symbols we use is language. We have arbitrarily used symbols and sounds to represent things or ideas in the world. For example, the English word tree. We use those sounds and those letters to represent those objects growing outside with roots and branches and leaves and fruit. But it's just an arbitrary symbol. If you're from a Hispanic subculture, it's going to be an arbol, right? Arbol or tree. And those are random things we have used, but there's a collective agreement that saying arbol means that thing growing outside if you're in a Spanish-speaking country, or if you're in an English-speaking country, it's a tree, etc. Symbols. And we have lots of symbols, right? Think of religious symbols. A cross represents Christianity. A crucifix with Christ on the cross generally indicates the Roman Catholic branch of Christianity. That's just a real simple distinction. The crescent and the star represents Islam. The six-pointed star or Solomon's seal represents Judaism, or the Star of David, right? And so simple little symbols like that, just a collection of lines, can bring us into an entire worldview or way of looking at things. Even things like obscenities, right? We have different hand signs or that we can use to imply or infer a curse word or an obscene word. And I'm not going to demonstrate for you at the moment, at least not our English ones, but in some cultures, doing something like that is an obscenity, right? And it's so funny because, once again, it's like using bloody. That doesn't have the same effect as if we were in England. Just like me doing that at you or doing this to you, you're probably not going to take great offense to. But in some cultures, if you did that to someone, you might get a bop in the nose because you're, thank you for that obscene gesture, because you're making some obscene gesture that they have been conditioned in their culture to take offense at. But it's purely symbolic, right? There's nothing innately obscene by just lifting your middle finger at someone or showing them the inside of your eyelid. But that has been culturally taught that those mean obscene things, or it's meant to be offensive to you. Okay, moving on. Our cultures also teach us classifications of reality. And I think this is like super interesting. Our culture is going to tell us how to identify who is our family. And you might be like, what are you talking about? Well, in American culture, I may know second, maybe a couple third cousins, but that's pretty much as far as I think in terms of these people are my family or I'm blood related to them. In other cultures, you're literally related to everyone. Everyone in the community or village or tribe is related to you in some way. And that is just fascinating to me. And I think about that in my own church. When I go to church, even though I'm not blood related to the members, we have such a family sort of interaction that even people that aren't blood related to me, the little kids call me Uncle Fred, people my age call me Brother Fred, And older people, I look at them as like my grandparents. And even though we're not blood related, but in that subculture of my church, that is like my family, my like spiritual or church family. And so culture is going to tell you who you're related to and how. It's also going to tell you what's food. And yes, believe it or not all cultures in the world see the same things as edible. What we may see as edible in Southern California may be very different than what people see as edible in Papua New Guinea, right? Or someplace in Southeast Asia, or even Europe for that matter. And so what is considered edible varies from time and place and culture, and you're brought up being taught those things. Friends, enemies, our culture teaches that. I was brought up my whole life being taught to fear the Russians and the Chinese, just enculturated from the news, from my schools. These are the threat to America. These are the ones that are trying to end democracy. These are the ones that are trying to displace us. And that was something, I mean, how many Chinese or Russian people have I met in my life? Not a whole lot, but I have been disposed in the way I was brought up by my culture to be wary of them and to see them as a potential threat or danger. And I just think that is super interesting. I saw a recent poll in Japan where they asked Japanese young people, if Japan got into another war, who would the most likely adversary be? And surprise, the majority answer was America, the United States of America. And I thought, wow, that's so interesting. But if you think of Japan's history, the interactions they've had with us in the past, we dropped 2 thermonuclear warheads on them. You could see why they perhaps would see us as a threat, more so than even China or Russia, their other powerful neighbors. Okay, so culture tells us family, food, friends, enemies. What else? It even gives us our worldviews. Like, how do we categorize reality? Are we a theist? Are we a pantheist? Are we a materialist? We're going to be brought up from a very young age having very different ideas about what reality is. Is it purely material, physical? Is there a spiritual element? Is it a combination of the physical and the spiritual? Your culture is going to get in your head and try to tell you one of those ways is true. Let me give you an example about categories. In the West, well, let me start with in the Amazon. I think this is the Yanomamo Indians. They have different categories of plants, animals, food, people. But they see things like banana leaves, frogs, and armpits as all part of the same category. And you might be thinking, wait a second, how could an armpit, a frog, and a banana leaf all be part of the same category? Well, it's because they're all things that are dry on top and damp underneath. And so that's a category they have of people that live in the jungle of dry on top things, damp underneath things. And I just think that is so fascinating. Now, in our scientific community, we would have things like whales, hippopotami, and hamsters all in the same category. How is a whale, a hamster, and a hippopotamus all in the same category? Well, they're all mammals, right? And so we see them all in that same category. It's so weird, but that is culturally brought to us. That's not just something that's happening in nature on its own. That's a human construct being imposed upon the world so that we can navigate it and interact with it. Any questions on that? Or does anyone else have any examples they'd like to share? I just love learning about this stuff. Think about something as simple as language. Like if I gave you a bunch of blocks of different sizes and I asked you to arrange them from smallest to largest, chances are you would start on the left with the smallest and you would keep stacking until you had the biggest on the far right descending down to the smallest on the left. Well, in English, we write from left to right. If you ask like a Hebrew or an Arabic person or to arrange things from smallest to largest, they would probably start on the right with the smallest and have the biggest on the left. And it makes so much sense when you understand their language. For others, like with the Chinese, they start on the top and write down. And so you would perhaps have the smallest furthest away from you and then the largest as it got close to you. Other cultures always speak to you from a directional point of view. So you always have to know what is north, south, east, and west, because they're always making reference. So they would start with smallest in front of them, moving away from them to largest. And it all has to do with part of how they see the world, how they navigate, and how they see their place into it. And it's even tied into how we write and read language. Okay, so interesting. Our cultures tell us how to interpret reality. What is real? What is false? So if your culture believed in ghosts and spirits and demons and gods, well, you're probably going to have a very different explanation why you hear creaking in the house at night than if you're being raised by materialists who might say, oh, it's just the floor settling, or it's just an exchange of heat, or the house is settling, whatever. That's going to be very different than to say, yeah, that might be Mr. Dunn who died in this house 20 years ago, and he's probably walking around or something. I mean, you're going to have very different explanations for things based on your worldview. Okay, culture and human life. You guys are doing good. I know I'm just fire hosing you, but we'll keep going.
I have a random question.
Yeah, Rhea.
Is it officially hippopotami or is it hippopotamuses? Is that like the scientific term?
I believe plural
I've
is
never heard hippopotami. I've heard octopi.
Singular is hippopotamus, but I don't believe it's hippopotamuses. But I am willing to be corrected on that. But I'm pretty sure plural is hippopotami. Then again, I might have just made it up. So we can have someone Google that for us. All right, so culture and human life. We have adaptation. Your culture provides you with the skills to adapt to the environment in which you live. For example, if I got dropped off in the Arctic, I probably would not survive the day. I simply was not brought up with the skill set and tools to understand how to survive in that environment. But the same way, if you dropped an Inuit off at a mall in Southern California, they may not survive the afternoon because they don't know how to navigate that kind of urban environment. And so depending on if you live in the jungle, the deserts, the Arctic, inner city, you learn different skill sets. I personally am quite uncomfortable in urban areas simply because I didn't grow up in a big city. And so whenever I visit a big city, it's like all my shields are up. I'm super vigilant. I'm on guard because I'm not comfortable. It's not my natural environment. But if I travel and with someone who's from the inner city, I mean, it's so normal for them, right? They know which streets to go down, which parks to avoid, where you shouldn't be after a certain time of night. But those are things, if you're not from that community or environment, you wouldn't know. Now, if you go into the mountains with me or the wilderness, I'm completely comfortable. And even though there's poisonous snakes and insects and bears and cougars and all this sort of thing, I'm perfectly comfortable because I know how to interact and relate in that environment. But if someone from the inner city comes with me out to the wilderness, they might be having panic attacks simply because it's not in their comfort zone. Just like when I'm in the inner city, I can be really uncomfortable because that's not my norm. And so that is part of what culture teaches you, how to be at home, how to survive in the world in which you live. Next is organization. Your culture tells you the basis for social life, and it provides my poor eyes are getting old. It provides guidelines and values. It also helps you pick a mate, how to find a spouse, a marriage partner, how to raise children, how to bring them up into your society. And it also provides, and I alluded to this earlier, a worldview and how to perceive reality. And I think it's so interesting in America right now, because this is when we talk about culture wars, that's part of what you see taking place in America is you have different visions or different view of what is reality. And we see that politically, right now, the Democratic view of reality and the Republican view of reality seem like we're dealing with two completely different realities. One of my favorite recent examples was, if you're familiar with what's been going on in Seattle and CHOP, the Capitol Hill occupation protest. I mean, it was eventually shut down, but I think for almost 2 months, there was like an 8-block section of downtown Seattle that was basically occupied by people in Seattle. And they were kind of having like their own little autonomous anarchist zone. And if you watch Fox News or more conservative news outlets, every time they talked about CHOP, they would be showing pictures of burning cars or buildings, police being assaulted, riots, people smashing out windows, just basically like chaos and anarchy in the streets. But if you would go over to MSNBC or CNN, it's like a farmer's market. It's like a love fest. People are playing guitars and singing and kumbaya in the streets, right? Now, both were showing real footage, but both were only showing you a piece of the reality. And Fox News was trying to portray chaos, anarchy, disturbances, and the more progressive or liberal news sites were trying to show more of like this community activism that was very positive and helpful and healing. Now, personally, I think the truth is probably somewhere in between, right? Or incorporating both of those extremes, but probably for a lot of Seattle people, their reality was somewhere in between those two extremes. I got to go there personally this summer, just about a month ago now, and it had already been shut down, but that's what I found. The truth was kind of in between what these major cable network news were trying to tell us. And that's part of the value, I would say, of watching local news, people that are actually in the communities, that are actually there. You're probably going to get a very different thing than someone looking from the outside on like a national level, right? And they have a different agenda that they're trying to use your local town to foster, whether that's the Democratic vision or the Republican vision. So that's just my caution and admonition to you. When you're looking at the news, it's super helpful to get a broad array of perspectives if you want to get closer to what's actually happening. All right, onward.
Like that kind of like relates to like things in almost like a religious, like biblical aspect.
Yes.
Because like you can just go around and hear everything from everywhere but the source, or you can go straight to the source and like have real like authentic truth, you know? So like, and I think that's like something that we kind of come face to face with in our world, is like just like the twisted like vision of reality, like distortion of it, like purposefully and intentionally. So yeah, I just thought that kind of like related.
Yes, thank you, Autumn. Religion's another good example, right? Like, think how different it is when you hear Christians describing the world and reality than, say, perhaps an atheist or a Buddhist or a Muslim. I mean, we're talking about the same world or culture, right? But we're seeing it through such incredibly different lenses. And a lot of that is because of how we've been taught religiously to look at the world and other people. A lot of people are quite put off by Islam because they see it as a very black and white worldview. Either you're in the house of faith or you're in the house of shaitan, of Satan. So which is it? Are you a faithful, devout Muslim who there is no God but God and Muhammad is his prophet? Or are you part of the world of the evil one? But if you're honest, as a Christian, isn't it the same thing for you? There's only two types of people in the world: those that love Jesus and have him in their heart, and those that don't. And those are two very different types of people. Or is that not how you see the world? But I mean, that's how I was brought up. You're either saved or you're damned. There's no like in between gray area. And that's how Islam is. That's how Judaism is. At least I'm talking in their orthodox fundamental manifestations. You certainly have progressive Jews, progressive Christians who might be much more universal. We're all going to get there, just in different paths, different ways, but not when you get to the more strict fundamentalist versions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They're all very exclusive types of religions, and they see things in a very black and white sort of way. Okay.
It also seems, sorry, like attempting to have like a broader and like a more in-depth understanding of different cultures is kind of like almost like a direct line to like greater empathy or like compassion.
Yes.
So like I don't know, that's why I'm like excited for this class.
Right, because once you understand why people believe or see things a certain way, it should help you, I hope, be more empathetic with, oh, okay, I get why you don't eat pork, or I get why you don't drink alcohol. That's something that's been instilled in you since you were a child, that's a bad thing or negative or displeasing to God. And so it's super helpful in navigate. It doesn't mean it's right or objectively true, but that is that person's reality. That is what they're using as a template by which to navigate the world. And you see how that affects Christianity too, right? Think how different Christians are in Alabama than they are in Southern California. I wrote a whole blog piece on California Christians because I just think it's such a unique phenomena. Because just like California culture is super eclectic, everything from our beliefs to our fashion, our music, to our cuisine. I mean, we even have a thing called California cuisine, and it's based on fusion, where we take bits and pieces, maybe from the south of the border, Mexico, Asian, old world foods, native foods, local crops, local things we grow, and we put them together. Like the California burrito, right? That's like a fusion, taking American cuisine and Mexican cuisine and putting them together. Or how about like a California roll? It's where we've taken Japanese cuisine and local California avocados and put them together into a new thing. You're probably not going to find California rolls in sushi restaurants in Tokyo unless they're catering to American tourists, right? Or a Philadelphia roll, right, with salmon and cream cheese. You're probably not going to find that in Kyoto or other places of Japan. And I just, and it's getting even more exotic, right? Like I saw this place called Tandoori Taqueria, and it was a fusion between Indian and Mexican food. And you've probably seen like Korean barbecue and tacos. And I just think it's absolutely fantastic. But that's how California is. We have so many different people coming together that we get a fusion. But it's the same with California Christianity. You can see elements of the East in it, like Eastern meditation, Eastern visualization techniques. But we also look back to the old world and maybe medieval labyrinths or the scriptures who have come down through the past. And I just love California, partly for that reason, because we do have so much diversity, and I like the fusion that takes place here. Anyways, onward. Now, at this part of the book, I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself. I don't think I am, but it's not in my notes. They talk about the difference between biology and behavior. And there's a theory called biological determinism. And what biological determinism says, inherited traits influence culture, or we could say race influences culture. But that's not helpful, right? Because we've already defined race as being one human race. So I think we're talking more about ethnicity here. We're talking about differences in body types and regions, But there are obviously physical differences, even if they're superficial: hair color, eye color, skin color, body types. And the question is, does people's biology affect their culture? And here's a prompt question. I'm going to take a poll vote. So I'm not sure how to do this. I'll just do a hand vote. So if you got your video, go ahead and turn your camera on just so I can take a quick vote here. How many of you would agree with this statement? And I'm talking about America here. Blacks are better athletes than whites. Okay, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How about you, Savannah? Yes, 6, 7. Okay, so I only can see like about 10 screens. And how many of you would say color of your skin or that sorts of genetics is not what affects whether or not you're a good athlete? And I got 4 or so on that. Okay, so how about if I change the question to are whites more intelligent than blacks? Okay, and there I get a universal no. So this is really curious, right? And it shows you the power of culture. We have been conditioned in American culture not to disparage races on things like intelligence, but it's okay to give a pass on things like athletic ability. But do you understand how both those statements are equally racist? Because it's making a value judgment or statement based on something like skin color. I mean, I didn't talk about muscle mass. I didn't talk about any other thing. We're basically just talking about a group of people. But you could go to sources, right? You could say, well, then how come even though African Americans only make up less than 13% of the general population, they dominate in sports like football, basketball, baseball, etc.? I mean, why is that if they're not superior athletes? And you would have to come up with different ideas or propositions. I mean, heavyweight boxing has been dominated by African Americans for decades, although that's beginning to change. The problem is, but see, I could do the same thing with, well, look at the vast majority of college professors are white. The vast majority of CEOs, CFOs, COOs are white. The vast majority of scientists are white. And you could use that to make a case to say, look, white people are smarter than black people. But there could be other explanations for why you see a disparity in the numbers. Just like in sports. What would be some other reasons you would see a disparity in the numbers of why you see African Americans seem to dominate in basketball? What would be another explanation besides they're simply genetically superior?
I would say like their experiences and how they grew up in the culture that they grew up in. Because I know for me, at least my black friends, like a lot of the like their expectations of their parents, especially when it comes to sports, is like they have a high standard when it comes to sports, or like Asian parents when it comes to school, they have a high standard. So it's not necessarily that they're smarter or that they're more capable in that act. Like they're just held to a higher standard, So like I guess your experiences and the standard you've been held to as a kid. So your experiences and basically, yeah, that's what kind of shapes you. That's what I would say, honestly.
Very good. Right. Or opportunity, right? Like most kids, even people living in urban centers or maybe not as having as much socioeconomic opportunities, there's usually at least a basketball court, right? But maybe not a pool. And you'll tend to find that most swimmers, water polo players, those sorts of things, white people dominate that. And once again, it simply could be because of opportunity. Those kids grew up with pools available where perhaps a lot of African American kids did not. And it doesn't mean, same with hockey, right? There perhaps aren't a lot of African Americans that have that sort of availability or living in circles where hockey is like this big deal. But things like basketball, football, baseball, there might be a lot more opportunity and a lot more, this is your chance, right? This is how you can make it. This is how you can have a better life. And you could imagine how much more you might invest into that if you knew college wasn't an option, opening up your own business wasn't an option. If it was, this is my ticket, this is where I want to put my energy and my resources. It also has to do with who you know, right? If you had a cousin or a brother or someone from your neighborhood who made a college or professional team, well, they're going to tell their coaches, hey, my homeboy, he's coming up. You might want to look into him and recruit from my school, recruit from my neighborhood. Same thing. If you're recruiting from a school, you're probably going to recruit people you knew, that you went to graduate school with, that you knew in a professional way. And that's why it's very important to give people, especially minorities or women or people who are not traditionally in certain fields, that opportunity, because it kind of like opens the door, not just for that person, but then for other people like them, because now they have a connection, now they have a bridge. And I think that's really important to realize how much culture influences things like that. So let me give you an example. African Americans have not always dominated boxing. Before African Americans dominated, do you know what ethnic group dominated boxing? Think
White
of the
people?
Rocky movies. What's that?
White people or European?
Right, but more specific.
Oh,
What type of European? Who was
Russian?
Rocky Balboa?
oh, just kidding. Oh, it's right here. Italian?
Italians. Italians dominated for a season. Almost all the heavyweight champions were Italian. But before the Italians, it was the Irish. The Irish dominated boxing. And my theory on that is it had to do with the socioeconomics of when those immigrants came to America. When the Irish first came, they were pretty much rejected. People did not want to hire Irish. They saw them as subhuman. They weren't seen as white. The Irish actually had to earn becoming white Americans because they were seen as non-white when they came here. And through struggle and all that, and you can see why that might produce fighters or boxers having to grow up in rough and tumble neighborhoods. And then it was the Italian immigrants that came in, and they had to go through the same struggles. They weren't seen as white when they came to America. Black people, even though they've been in America longer than either of those groups' immigrations, I don't know that they'll ever be perceived as white in America, right? For a variety of reasons. And the ones that are perceived as white often face backlash from their own people, as like being Uncle Toms or Oreos or whatever derogatory term they want to call them. Like you're complying with the oppressor, or you're not being true to your own race. But who can tell me who the new up and coming heavyweight boxers are? What ethnicity?
Hispanic.
Hispanic. And that is my theory, that Hispanics are the newest wave of white Americans, right? As they become more enculturated, they take on things. If you look at like the Border Patrol, these sorts of things, you see a lot of movement of assimilation. Now, not total, they're obviously adding part of their cultural elements, part of their background, part of their history, but there's a lot of assimilation, especially in the West and California, of Hispanics and Anglo culture.
Blackburn.
Yeah.
Did you see Mike Tyson though?
What about Mike Tyson?
Coming out of retirement.
Like for real? Like more than just wrestling
I
sharks?
forget who he's gonna fight.
Oh, he's fighting next week.
Wow. Well, that is gutsy.
Oh, he's crazy too. He's like, he looks just like when he left off. Maybe a little bit more stiff, but like still like a monster. It's crazy.
We'll see how he stands up to some young whippersnapper.
Yeah, true.
Interesting. Okay, so there's a lot of things you have to look into, but when you make these blanket assumptions, whether it's through physical athletic ability, intelligence, creativity, If you just start making these blanket racial judgments, that is classic racism, because you're not taking into account all these other individual criteria or circumstances that could have led to athletic ability, intelligence, creativity, whatever the criteria may be. So I just want you to be aware of that. Another theory is, now to be fair though, say you're living in like a Swahili culture, or a culture where the people are judged on their physical beauty by the darkness of their skin, by the fullness of their lips, by the whiteness of their eyes, by the woolly texture of their hair, and they're tall and slender with beautiful teeth. And someone like me shows up into that tribe, some little short white bearded gnome, I'm probably not going to get a mate or be asked to join the beauty pageant, right? Because genetically my makeup is not matching what that culture sees as beautiful. But vice versa, if you came to my little mountain gnome community and saw the bearded men and women, and you didn't fit into that physique, no matter how beautiful you appeared back in your homeland or country, you're probably not going to be a standout beauty in gnome land. And so I think there is some biological element. Another example, no matter how determined I am in my spirit and will, no matter how good a coach I have or how much I train, I am not going to be able to dunk a basketball on a 10-foot hoop. It's simply physically not going to happen. And that is going to affect probably my athletic performance, or I'm going to have to find other ways to make points in basketball besides dunking. Like, I better get good at my 3-point shot, because chances are if I drive to the hoop, these 6-7 foot people are just going to be like a tower over me. There's not a lot I'm going to be able to do. And so I'm not saying biological aspects don't influence culture, but I think you have to be careful not to over credit them. All right. Next is this idea of geographic determinism. And it's kind of this idea that depending on where you grew up in the world, it's going to affect the type of culture you have. And I actually think there's more validity to this than the biological one. Because if you put a template, an overlay of where the Industrial Revolution took place, it's in these temperate northern climes. If you compare that with like the Mediterranean region, the Industrial Revolution came much later to those countries like Greece, Italy, Spain, than it did to Germany, to the Netherlands, to England, to the Nordic countries. And I'm not saying Germanic Nordic people are more industrious or intelligent or smarter than Mediterranean people. I think the climate actually affects people's industry to a degree. If you're living in cold or temperate climes, you have to keep busy to keep warm. If you're living closer to the equator, you want to move slower. You want to take it easier. The singer Jimmy Buffett had this song called Changes in Latitudes, Changes in Attitudes. And his premise was the further south you went, the chiller and more relaxed people got. And I've done a lot of traveling in the Caribbean and Central America, and at least from my personal observation, it is true. It's the further south you go, people get a little more relaxed, a little more chill. They ain't out there busting their butt in that hot tropical sun like you would see people doing up in Minnesota or Wisconsin. It's like a very different mentality and mindset. And so that will be an essay, one of the essay question choices on the test. Does biology or geography affect culture? And I think to some degrees it does, but I think we have to be cautious not to overstate the cases. All right, onward. Here's some of the evidence against biological determinism. Any race, and this is if we're taking like the social Darwinist races, Mongoloid, Caucasoid, Negroid, any race can learn any culture. Okay, so that's interesting. But my follow-up question would be, like my example of beauty, would they be as successful as someone who came from that region or from that ethnic group? And maybe not. Cultural diversity occurs within the same race. So for example, just because people are white or black, it doesn't even mean they participate in the same culture, right? I mean, think how different, I'll never forget, I was working in this warehouse in South Carolina, and we were loading trucks, and I was working with this African-American man, but he was from Los Angeles, and I was also from California. And here we are, these two Californians, a black and white Californian, working in this warehouse in South Carolina. But we had more in common with our shared California culture than we did with our physical appearances, right, of those things. But we were culturally both shocked to be in South Carolina and how those people looked at different races or skin colors. And both of us, by the end of our shift, were just thinking, we can't wait to get back to California. It was just so difficult to navigate that Southern culture from where we had come from. Okay. Also, culture changes generationally. Within itself, culture changes are more rapid than genetic changes. So, for example, think even at our own school, 50 years ago, when the school was started, if we were in the classroom, how we look right now, just looking around, all of us would be sent home and told to come back to school when we were dressed for it and we were serious about our education. And you're all dressed perfectly appropriately for what we're doing now, but that is one of the changes that has happened over just my lifetime. In fact, we've had a different dress code or student guidelines every year I've been a teacher at this school. It's just mind-numbing to try to keep track of it. But that's like changes happening within the same group, in the same place, simply spread out over time. All right, and finally, I want to get to cultural universals. Even though we see so much diversity in the world, there are some things that all cultures in all places at all times have in common. And this sounds like another good essay question. So if you want to take some notes on this. So here's some things that all cultures have in common. They all have a concept of food, some sort of modesty, a sense of shelter, their sex and gender roles, tool use, communication, cooperation. There's roles that are based on gender and age.
Slow down.
Yeah, bro. Like, why are you speeding through this, bro? Like, I can't.
I'm sorry. I'll start again. I forgot that I'm not writing these on the whiteboard, my virtual whiteboard. So cultural universals. Everyone has a concept of food, of some sort of covering or modesty, shelter, sex mores, tool use, communication, cooperation, education, roles, and we're going to talk about roles when I'm done with this list. Roles can be based on gender, age, life experience, taboos. We did a taboo talk last class. Rules, laws, norms, values, belief in the supernatural, art, and classifications for reality. These are things you can find in all cultures at all times in the world. Now, even though these are universals, so the concept of modesty is a cultural universal. How that's going to look is going to be wildly different depending on the culture you're in. So, for example, I read this account of this Arab Bedouin who was taking some European tourists across the Sahara in like a caravan. And his wife and family was with him. And his wife's camel got spooked and knocked her off the camel. And even though she was wearing a full burqa, it flipped up over her head. And so she was exposed like the day she was born with everything but her face. And he ran over, helped straighten her out, got her burqa back down. And the Europeans are kind of trying to avert their eyes, right, be polite. But then this Arabic Muslim man praised his wife for keeping her virtue and her modesty. And the Europeans were kind of snorting like, we don't know what you saw, but we pretty much saw the whole thing. But see, from his culture and his mindset, as long as she was able to keep her face covered, she was able to keep her virtue or her modesty. Even though she shouldn't intentionally be flashing people with her burqa, she did what she needed to do in that extreme accident of being thrown from a camel. Now, in other cultures, as long as someone is wearing body paint, they feel like they're wearing clothing. But if that paint got washed off, they would feel as naked as you or I would without clothes. Or it might simply be a string tied around their abdomen with a bead on it. As long as they have that string and a bead, they feel perfectly clothed and modest. If that bead comes off, they would feel naked and embarrassed like we would. Isn't that interesting? And so we're even conditioned about modesty from our culture. And think about growing up, how we have different standards of modesty for young children, adolescents, and mature or old people. And that is something we are taught as a cultural role. All right, roles, and I'll let you go with this one. We're all given roles in our culture and society, and often these roles are based on gender. We have masculine and feminine roles, but they're also based on age. Like our expectations and norms for the roles of children is going to be different from adolescents, from adults, from old people. And so this isn't, maybe this is what I'll do for the discussion board for, I already have the discussion board up for week 2. That's all you have to do for this week. Do the reading and answer the discussion board by Sunday midnight, 11:59 p.m. on Sunday. Hope you have a nice long holiday. And maybe next week on the discussion board, I'll ask you, what are your roles? Let me give you an example of some of mine. I'm a son. I have the role of being a son to my mother. And that comes with certain rights, expectations, obligations, and privileges, right? And I am judged on whether I'm a good or bad son by my culture based on how well I fulfill those obligations. But there's also privileges being the son of my mother. She has a certain type of nurturing and care and compassion and love for me that she has for lots of people, but mine is in like this special role and relationship because I am her only son. And so there is that thing. I'm also a brother. Same thing. There's certain rights, expectations, obligations, and privileges that come from being a big brother. And I am judged by my culture and society by how well I adhere to that. I'm also an uncle dad. I have children that look up to me, I raise, I have certain expectations of them, but they have certain things they can request of me that people that don't have that role or relationship in my life don't have access to. I'm a friend, and I have certain tiers of friendship. I have acquaintances, I have Facebook friends, I have inner circle lifer friends. And each one of those roles or relationships comes with different rights, privileges, responsibilities, etc. I'm a teacher, okay? That comes with those things. I'm also a student. I'm a part of a church. All of these different roles in my life have different things that go with it. And so probably in our third discussion board, I'm going to ask you to think about what are some of the roles you have in our culture and society, and what kind of expectations come with those roles, but what kind of privileges or rights do you have in those relationships? Now, the problem for me with roles is, even though I have them and I acknowledge them, that's not how I want to be labeled or identified or judged, right? Because I'm more than just my roles. My roles are a relationship or things I do, but it's not who I am at the core of my being. And the problem when we have such strong roles in our society, for example, many women see their identity in terms of their role as wife or mother. Well, what happens if they get divorced or they can't have children or one of their children dies? For many women, they feel like they've lost their identity or their very self because they had tied their identity into these roles or relationships they had. For many men in our culture, they tie their identity to the roles they have in their employment or their standing in their church or their community. And if they lose their employment or their standing, they too may feel like they've lost their identity or who they are. And so I really want to caution you, don't confuse your roles with that core internal self of who you are. Roles and relationship are relationships or things you do, but they are not that inner being of who you are. And with that, chapter 2 of humanity, and we'll do chapter 3 next class. I'll linger a couple minutes if anyone has any question. Whoa, there's a lot of chat in here. Let me see what's going on in the chat box. Oh, it's the hippopotamus
that was like
talk.
throughout. Yeah. That was a lot throughout, but yeah.
All right.
Thanks, Fred.
Is everything clear so far for everyone?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. For the most part, yeah. I think it's been pretty good.
It's pretty straightforward.
Yeah.
Good.
100%. Well,
All
I'll see you
righty.
in 15 minutes. And yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to do the pluralist. So I'll see you soon.
Yes, sir.
Bye-bye.
Bye.